You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. With me, as always, is Lord Uther, and joining us this week, our recurring host, Ricky Wild Thing Vaughn. Welcome, fellas. Welcome, welcome.
Give him the heater.
Well, we are on episode 26. We have crossed the quarter century mark, and we are into newfound territory, if you will, with Strange New Worlds. We are talking episodes 7 and 8 this week. And I gotta say, it's not a two-parter. This is more of a timing release thing because they dropped episode 7 on us just unexpectedly a day after the last episode, episode 6, dropped. And I was thrilled, for one. I'll volunteer that right away because I was really looking forward to episode 7, the now infamous crossover with Lower Decks, and of course episode 8 released as planned the following Thursday. I mean, we'll talk about that of course as well. But as always, as we've started the show during the now very much talked about SAG-AFTRA strike, I'd like to bring up again that we are standing in solidarity with SAG-AFTRA and really hope for a fair and reasonable deal for those striking. If you see someone out there on the picket line, bring them some water, because holy Hannah, is it ever hot in the Southwest right now. Ricky, I think you can agree with that. Hot everywhere. And to key in on the hotness, we've got some pretty spicy lines from our special guest stars in the first of the 2 episodes we'll talk about tonight. But as always, I'd like to kick it over to our man with the plan, Mr. Wild Thing, with a little bit of background and info on episode 7.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. Thanks to you at home. Hashtag SAG-AFTRA and hashtag WGA. Well, we are talking episode 7, Those Old Scientists, TOS, the crossover episode with Lower Decks. Now, Lower Decks is the first animated Star Trek series put out on the streaming channel. It premiered in August of 2020, and next month will begin its 4th season on Paramount Plus. And it is following one of Starfleet's least important starships, the USS Cerritos. It takes place in the 24th century, around the time of DS9 and the Next Generation and so forth. And it focuses on the low-ranking ensigns and crew members of the Cerritos. So all those episodes where we saw the Enterprise and all these ships come in and do intergalactic heroics, it's the Cerritos who comes in afterwards and has to do all the grunt work and heavy lifting while the Picard and everyone fly away to their next mission. So that is the basic premise. We had 4 characters from Lower Decks represented here, and 2 of them making the leap to live action. Jack Quaid, the son of Dennis and Meg Ryan. He played Bradward Boimler, an ensign. And Tawny Newsome played the greatest named character in Star Trek thus far, Beckett Mariner, a very hyperactive 24th century peer of Bradward. The episode was directed by a man who needs little introduction, and that was Jonathan Frakes. And if you were ever going to assign an animated live-action crossover episode, you would want Jonathan Frakes at the helm. The man has had multiple big screen, little screen Trek adventures under his belt, so he was a surefire sailor. It was written by Catherine Lynn and Bill Wolkoff. Catherine Lynn is a new writer, I believe, for this season. She co-wrote episode 5 of this season with the showrunner Henry Alonzo Myers. It was Charades. We talked about that a couple of episodes ago. Spock's DNA is healed, and he has to face his Vulcan in-laws with decidedly human results. So Catherine has written some lighter moments for this show. Wolkoff, this was his first episode of this season, and he will also co-write the one that drops this week, the musical episode, Subspace Rhapsody. So he had 2 light episodes dropping within 3 weeks of each other. He also worked on the animated show Star Wars Rebels, so he knows his way around animated shows. In the season 1, Wolkoff, he was a little more serious. He co-wrote Ghosts of Illyria, which is where we discover Una's genetic past. And he also did episode 6, Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach, which is when Captain Pike found a civilization that would sacrifice a child to a machine god. And that had a lot of moral grays and shadows in that one as well. So he was writing dark stuff in the first season, and now they've got him on doing the lighter detail. So, all right, full confession, I had never seen anything regarding Lower Decks before this episode, so I came into it as a brand new observer. It looks fun. I mean, it's a very sort of rat-a-tat-tat dialogue style and irreverence and all of that, and perhaps it's something I can circle back to and check it out. There's even an amusing Jerry O'Connell cameo at the end of the episode, which is funny on a couple levels because A, he comes off as a total bro Starfleet officer, but he's married to Una, Rebecca Romaine, so when he says that she's the hottest chick in Starfleet and high fives the nearest person he walks by, it's actually a nice in-joke, giving a shout out to his wife. But he's also a regular on the series. The message of this is something I think we can get into briefly. Never meet your heroes. Never seemed more appropriate. For years, I've dreamt about meeting Joe Montana or Stephen King or people that have had an outsized influence in my life. John Williams, the composer, Steven Spielberg, whomever. But there's always that nagging fear that we have that what if you were actually in a room with them or having dinner with them or in an elevator with them and they completely played against whatever you believed in them as an athlete or a composer or a director? What if they, made a shockingly inappropriate comment, or what if they turned out to be rude, or what if they just ignored you? John Landis ignored me in a restroom when I was seeing a movie. I was, all prepared to tell him how much I loved the Blues Brothers and Animal House and Trading Places, and I was clearing my throat, and he brushed past me like I had leprosy. So I've, a personal example of never try to talk to John Landis in a restroom. But I'm curious with you guys about your heroes, people that you idolized growing up or idolize now in your current state, and would you have hesitation to want to meet them, or would you overcome that and say, no, I want to be in the room where it happens. I want to break bread with my heroes and the people I look forward to. So I'm curious, who are your heroes? And do you have that kind of fear that they might turn out to be less than you expected?
We were talking about this right before the podcast, actually. But so anyway, that's a great question, Urza. I just stole the spotlight from you, and I apologize because I always let you go first.
This is a first on the second quartile of a century for the Warp Core. Lord Uther's going to take it away.
I couldn't help. Well, I wanted to throw the first line in there. That's why. But it's. I love what Charles Barkley said, and he said we shouldn't be your heroes, and I and I think that's an excellent point. I think there's a difference, right? I can look to an athlete and admire them for what they've done. I can look to an athlete and be wowed by their skill. I can look at an athlete and kind of say, "Man, I wish my game was like that." But once you kind of break that barrier, I do think it's something. I do think it's something different because the quote Forrest Gump, "You never know what you're going to get," and that can ruin people sometimes, right? Like I see all this stuff about Shaq, who's a very generous person, and Shaq, I know you watch podcasts, so I can talk about this, right? Very generous person, does a lot of great things, and then you read about, why him and his wife got divorced and all these other things, all these personal details. It's almost like, again, those are two different things, and I don't know if I want to know that much. My heroes to me was like my grandmother, yeah, who when and my father, because when my biological father skipped town, my grandmother took care of my mom and I, and then my stepdad, who I call my dad, was a man and took care of us. Like, those are my heroes. Those are the people I look up to. Those are the people I want to be like. So I think that's a great question. I don't think I would want to really know those people beyond that, or maybe a quick conversation with them. So that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I kind of agree with Barkley on that as well. Although I like to meet the meatball myself. I love Charles Barkley. I wouldn't count him as one of my heroes. I just really enjoy the man. I kind of like a Shaq, and I think it's one good thing that's come out of the social media era, which, by the way, you can follow us on Facebook and YouTube.
Wonderful.
But you kind of get to see these parts of people that you would not have otherwise seen before, and it makes you realize, well, and with the internet too, and just how lightning fast we hear about everything these days, like there's really you can't tell what's real or not sometimes. And even if you do the right thing and try to give people space and time to explain themselves, or the due process of law in some cases, you start to realize that the people who you idolized as a kid when you didn't have these things aren't the people you thought they were. Or some people that you really may not have enjoyed as a kid were actually really tremendous, amazing people. And you start hearing about all this incredible stuff they did, and you're like, wow, I wish I would have idolized them instead of this person or that person. So, like, for me growing up, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Brett Favre, they were heroes of mine. I loved action movies, and I loved football. And, in real life, some of the things they've done I don't totally agree with, or they've diminished in my sight a little bit because of all the information we know about each other now, which is kind of unfair because I'm a believer, as I think Boimler is now, that when you meet people and interact with them, yeah, sometimes you're a little disappointed, but sometimes you sort of learn things about people that humanize them to you. When you're actually breaking bread with them, when you're actually sitting down and getting to know them, where it's like, yeah, if you run into somebody in a Starfleet bathroom, Captain Picard might brush right past you. But if you're in a pub with Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, by God, you're going to have a good time. And if you get to spend, a couple of days, like our Boimler does in this episode, with these people you've idolized, I think the gut reaction or the quick shot is that, wow, they're not really who I thought they were, and I kind of want to go home. But then as you're there for a little bit longer, you're like, wow, I really actually value this experience. Like, you're different in my eyes now, but at first it may have been in a negative way, but it comes back around. Like, I think that's one cool thing that this episode did, that, for all the fun on the surface stuff and the hijinks we get to see, you really start to bring the humanity out of the show again. And that was really interesting to watch, is like, especially the Boimler Spock thing where they're, trying to fabricate that material in the lab and they blow it up, and it's like, oh man. But if you think about it, on a deeper level, which I know we often do on this show, but let's be honest, I was just enjoying this episode as it was happening to me because I was so stoked about what they were doing. The deeper message there is like when you actually take the time to get to know somebody who may on the surface be very different than what you know of them or what you've been told or what you've seen in historical references or whatever, you kind of get this sticker shock that if you can get past, you really get to know how similar you are to them, and it takes on a much deeper, maybe more special meaning. Like, you know, I think about like a Brett Favre. You know, there are a lot of things he's done that as a kid he was just my idol because he was the man in Green Bay and like a god when he walked on the field. Some shit happened later in his career off the field, and I'm like, ooh, man, I don't know that I like the guy as much. And then I meet people who've either known him or met him or hung out with him or his family, and they're like, yeah, I don't believe everything that you read. Like, yeah, did those things happen? For sure. But he's also the guy that goes and mows the median for the highway in front of his property, drinking a beer on his lawnmower. I'm like, how cool is that? He's the guy that tips well when he comes into the local diner and has lunch. He's the guy that's not afraid to talk to whomever if they want to talk football or the weather or whatever. He's way more salt of the earth than you'd think. But if you're just up in his business or you're overly fangirling like I probably would do, he might not be the nicest fella because, let's face it, as celebrities go, they don't really want somebody who's just up in their business all the time. They'd much rather interact with somebody more genuine, more warm than somebody who's just gushing or somebody who's overcritical. So I always think about that when I'm watching this episode, like, you just take it for what it is and not just go, oh my God, it's Captain Christopher Pike. It's Christopher Pike, and he's going to make you lunch. I mean, that. There's always something a little deeper there with Star Trek, and I think the overall message here is like, beyond don't meet your heroes is what you're always told. I think it's don't be afraid to understand that behind the hero, there's a person. You know, don't be afraid to get to know the other, because the person behind the other can be somebody who's really special to you. And that's such a Star Trek trope. I mean, that is such a Star Trek message. It gets back to Roddenberry's vision, where, you know, taking the sting out of the other, be it the alien race, be it the East versus West, you know, dogma that he was trying to dissect in the TOS era. That idea that there's a common humanity among all of us, a common connection between all things is such a cool way to play out. And you don't think of it with this episode because it is so fun. It is so goofy. It is such a fantastic little premise. And by the way, they're almost kind of beating you over head with it in this episode with the whole Orion pirate thing, which was not lost on me. I saw the irony in that right away, and I'm like, oh, that's good. That's good. So I'll turn it back to you guys.
I think you're bringing up great points, because the one thing we've seen from this series that just kind of hit me as you're explaining all that, they're not afraid to take risks. That was a risk. This, with the episode coming up that we've already been talking about a little bit, that's going to be a risk, right? Like, you know, bringing the Gorn in as an aliens type of bad guy, that's a risk, because the first time you watch that, you're like, that's aliens. The Gorn are total aliens, but they're going to put their own spin on it. So I that's the other thing I've really been admiring about the show is they'll kind of go outside the typical just writer's box in a sense, maybe not even Star Trek, just in general, and they're going to do those things, which is what makes this show so special, as we continue to say. Like, keep taking the risks. Here we are, in a sense, thinking all season long we were going to get the Gorn, and we've barely had, I mean, a couple times here and there we've had a mention, and that's been it. To me, that's kind of a risk, because they were setting that up at the end of last season a little bit, that maybe that's what season 2 is going to be about. So I give them a lot of credit for that.
When they announced that they were going to do this ambitious live-action animated crossover, obviously they had two ways to go with it. And here, they took a couple of the animated characters, and I'd like to point out that the actors who played them on the animated show got to play them in flesh and blood, the same voice cast. Next month, or actually now this month, when Star Wars Ahsoka comes on, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to have animated characters as live action, but they had to recast. Like, none of the actors who are playing those roles that are animated roles will be the same. So I thought this was interesting that we actually were able to use Quaid and Tawny Newsome, who give voice to these characters, but could also realistically, look like them in the real life. But they chose to take, for the most part, 90% of the episode was animated characters who are suddenly flesh and blood, and we have to get them back. How would you guys have felt if we'd gone the other way, which is suggested in the clever final scene of this episode, where if we had taken our established New World characters, Strange New World characters, and made them all animated for an episode running around in the 24th century? I mean, again, it's six of one, half a dozen of another. It's purely an aesthetic point, but which one would you have preferred to have the animated people suddenly be flesh and blood, or to have Pike and M'Benga and Spock and Number One suddenly now be goofy cartoon, animated, trying to get back to their universe? I'm curious which ones you would have preferred.
That's a really good thought. Having seen this episode now, I'm open to it because I really enjoyed sort of the flip-flop. I think it would be very interesting to do like a live-action reverse crossover now on Lower Decks. Now, I don't know that you necessarily need to do it with the Strange New Worlds cast, but if there was another concurrent Star Trek series going, I think that's a really interesting possibility there. Likewise, I really like the idea of doing a little something outside the box. I remember when we were first talking about this an episode or two back, I made the comparison to the Scooby-Doo episode of Supernatural, and as cheesy as that was, that particular crossover, it still was pretty fun. It still involved some movement of the canon, if you will, but not like this. I mean, this really, like, I'm all about structure and flip-flopping structure and, reanalyzing, like, how would this have worked? I think the way they did it with the little homage at the end was kind of a nod to the fact that they didn't do that. Because I think that is maybe what folks were expecting when they announced that this was going to happen, but we didn't really know many details. It's like, ooh, are they going to do an all-animated, episode? Like, or something thereof? I'm like, actually, now I'd be kind of on board for that after having seen what they've done. So it definitely was a risk in the best way. But I think, again, here I go off on my writing soapbox. I really credit the writers here because you have to so delicately construct an episode like this, and you have to work with a writing staff that may or may not be completely involved with your series. So, like, you can't change or add anything to those characters that they don't approve of on their show, and at the same time, you have to have the same from them, so they can't impose anything upon you either. And it acted in perfect concert. And I think the only director that could pull that off is Jonathan Frakes, because he is one of the very talented directors that when he directs something, you don't know it's him until you know it's him, and you go, oh yeah, I see it now. And that's the best kind of director there is.
And I'd be hard-pressed to look back at his work in the features for the Next Gen that we talked about, or some of his other episodic work with Picard or what have you. It's a Jonathan Frakes episode, one, because he likes to film like these really serene Hamlets like we had in Insurrection and Picard. So that's a sure giveaway. But number two, he never lets the humanity get eclipsed by whatever the gimmick is, if you will, the special effects, in this case, the crossover. Like, his episodes to me stand out as having this warm embrace human side. And I think that's just instinctual with him. Even First Contact, one of the darkest of the four next gen films, the humanity is what we talked about when we analyzed that one that comes through. So I think not only could he handle it from a technical standpoint and all the various things which he handles with aplomb, but when you're asking to take that risk, and for people who may not be invested in either show, maybe there's people that don't watch Strange New Worlds but can't get enough of Lower Decks, for example. When you ask them to come to somebody else's party and be a guest at someone else's table, I think Frakes is the guy. I mean, that's the first guy on the call sheet for me as far as who I want to be able to deliver it, because he's never just going to make it about, oh, look what we did, how clever we are. We had them, they're live action now and so forth. I thought that Uhura in this episode, although it wasn't an Uhura episode, I thought was very good, as she had her scenes with Tawny Newsome. I thought that the Spock and Boimler scene where they're trying to synthesize yet another fuel. How many fuels does Star Trek have? We should do a running tally. Lithium and this lithium and all that lithium. I did mention to Lord Uther before the show, the one thing that if I had a little quibble on this episode, I didn't like it when the writers seemed to make Spock like an obvious comic foil. I know that intrinsically the theme of this story is Boimler's reaction, like, you're not Spock. Spock is serious, and I understand why it's in there, but for me the comedy and the joy of Ethan Peck's performance is when he's doing his natural Spock, his natural Vulcan, his natural balance between human and Vulcan sides. And then he'll say something like, I will try to keep my practice down, when he gets a noise complaint and Lon's at his door. Like, that cracks me up. But when they do a close-up of him attempting a smile, like a goofy grin, I don't know. There was something about it. It's like asking him, hey, will you slip on this banana peel? Like, for me, it's like, don't try to...
Terminator 2.
Right. Don't try to write exactly. There's another one. James Cameron can be cited for that. Don't try to say, okay, we're going to write a funny Spock scene, because inherently Spock, the humor of it is how we perceive, how he perceives the world around him. And so I just think, a little of that will go a long way. Obviously, like in Charades, which is an episode that Catherine Lynn, this writer, worked on. That was great. He was overreacting because he was a human, and we were seeing him in contrast. But I think Spock works best when you don't try to do the obvious pratfalls or, let's give Spock a funny bit of business here. Like, I don't know. As a writer in me, I just I like it when it feels more organic to what's going on in terms of his character. So those were, and Pike was good in this because he's got to deal with the Orion captain, and he's got to do it in such a way, that he can't fire phasers and so forth. He's got to actually do diplomacy. I know that Lord Uther is talking about emphasizing exploration over, the military aspects of it and how he appreciates that in this show. And I like here that Pike, who by nature is someone who's going to try to come to the table and do that, he had no choice, but he had to kind of try to figure out a way to do it without causing another interstellar incident and so on. They had to get this piece of, machinery back without. So that was good. I thought that was well played and well realized.
My my only slight issue, there didn't seem to be a whole bunch of concern about the timeline. I felt like they were dropping things left and right that they should not have been saying. I'm surprised they weren't isolated more. And again, I know it's a TV show, but usually there's all this concern about the timeline, and it was more of like a don't tell me that kind of thing versus this could screw everything up. Right. Like, you shouldn't be doing any of this.
Like when Lon was admonished after her, dalliance in with Kirk and so forth. They literally showed up and said, you better not say anything, or,
Yeah, so that was my only slight issue with the episode was, again, not a whole bunch of concern for the timeline.
And I thought that was kind of a neat comic foil. So I kind of took that the opposite way. Is like, Lon like informs him right away, like, you shouldn't violate temporal prime directive, and they're like, how do you know? And they're like, it played off as really pure comedy, which in the Frakes directed episodes of season 3 of Picard, you got a lot of those comic moments from him where it was just like, I mean, that's almost so obvious. It's actually kind of like cheesy in a good way, where it's like, wow, it's so obvious that they're just breaking the rules here, but nobody's coming after him with phasers armed, right? Like, it's so painful that it's like, it's actually kind of funny again. It kind of goes full circle where I'm like so annoyed with it. I'm like, you know what? That's actually pretty funny. Like, it's like a suspension of disbelief within a suspension of disbelief in a way for me. So I came into this with a real critical hat because I had heard about Lower Decks, but the one thing that I can't stand about animations these days is a lot of them fall under the same category if they're trying to do too much, or be too radical and in your face, or goofy and oddball or gross out or something. I think of that one really popular one with the weird science guy that looks like, what's his name from Back to the Future, and the kid.
Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty, thank you. I really can't stand that show. I gave it a good couple episodes, and I'm like, woof. It tries too hard. I mean, and that's what I really worried about with Lower Decks is like, is this trying too hard to be both Star Trek and funny / sort of like adult humorish, kid friendly, but not really aimed at kids? I think that there are too many people out there that try and strike a balance where they're like, we know we can't market to kids even though we're a cartoon, so we have to lean real heavy into the adult aspect, but we only want like a certain segment of the population to really enjoy it, so we have to be very super topical, or completely upend a convention of whatever we're rebooting or redoing. And I don't like that. I'm not that kind of guy. I respect the effort, but I don't really truly care for a lot of those shows. So I was very skeptical. And then when it came in, I was like, and then it really grew on me in a hurry because it felt genuine. I have no other way to describe it other than it felt really like the people writing it or the people acting behind it cared about the source material, which I don't know that I necessarily feel from every show adjacent cartoon or reboot cartoon. I don't feel that they always respect what they're using, in terms of sourcing and or origination. But one thing I really enjoyed, which I knew was just one of those goofy things where they're like, sort of poking around adult humor, but then they kind of bring it back and make it a little more wholesome, is the whole Boimler's nervous around Una. Because immediately I was in his shoes. I'm like, I know I'd be tongue-tied and wouldn't be able to talk to Una if I met her. Like, I think every fangirl of Una stepped into Boimler's shoes and was like, oh my god, that's me. I would definitely have a pinup of her in my bunk, even if it was just a recruiting poster, and that's why it was there. And that's like that. I have to say that joke got me. It was cheesy, it was silly, it was just pure fun. But I ate every ounce of it up, and I'm like, oh my god, this is fabulous. I mean, it's really, truly, like, really leaning hard into this, I don't know what it is, like, the Comic-Con guy in me that, like, wants to go and meet all these people, but then I'm kind of like, will I even be able to talk? Like, if I go to Patrick Stewart's table, am I even going to be able to say anything, like, remotely interesting to him, or am I just going to be like, I really liked you in Vicious? I mean, it's going to be one of those tricky situations. So it's really cool. Like, I don't know. Again, I know this is a fan service type show where I like to gush, and I'm very much never critical. But it was one of those things that just, you really saw yourself in this episode. And I don't know if that's just the acting or the writing or the direction of Jonathan Frakes. I think it's like this perfect combination of all three. And it just it just lined up for me.
Yes.
Awesome.
All right,
And with that,
let's rate this bad boy here.
should we rate it or do we want to talk episode 8 first? I'm open.
Oh, I thought we were gonna
Yeah,
let's
let's
rate it.
we can rate this
Let's rate
one. It has its own identity, and then we can do
Yeah, we'll jump into the next one.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Who
Fair
wants to go
enough.
first? Okay, I'll go first because I suggested it. I'm sorry. I'm gonna go. Ooh. I'm gonna go 6 out of 7 warp cores. I enjoyed. I can't give every episode 7 out of 7. I just because we talked about this last week. They're pushing the level of writing and everything just so high. This was a good episode. Again, I struggled with the timeline thing a little bit. I really didn't think about it from the perspective of them kind of making a joke of the timeline thing, kind of. But that's an interesting point. So yeah, I would probably go. I'm going to go 6 out of 7 more course.
I'm going to concur with Lord Uther there. I think 6 is the right way to go because, again, it is a delicate dance. There are several ways this could have gone sideways. There are several ways where we could have found it flat or unengaging or a step down from prior season highs. And while it won't be, the top episode that we might see this season, reserving for ones that we have and for ones that are still to come, I think it's no easy feat, if someone says to you, yeah, we want to do, a show and bring 2 casts together, but this isn't Golden Girls, and Punky Brewster. I mean, you have 2 shows in two different mediums, and you have to make that work. And as UrzaMaster alluded to, the easier way to do it would have just been to do a 47-minute animated episode, no actors on set, just everyone showing up in there and recording their lines and then doing all that. I'm not going to say it's the most, it probably is the most obvious way to go, but they went harder. And they said, we're going to take the actual voice actors, we're going to put them in flesh and blood and show the contrast between the 24th century point of view and this current star date. They got 120 years gap between them. So I appreciate that. Like I say, Frakes' direction, very solid. He was the right man behind the camera, and he brought out the best of both crews. So yeah, I'd say a good 6.
I like that. I like that perspective quite a bit. And I have a couple of things before I get to my rating, but I like to think about, what would you do in their shoes, in Boimler's shoes, if you were transported 120 years ago? I think about if I was transported 120 years ago and I was suddenly on, let's say, the Ludlow homestead, would I also fall in love with Samuel's fiance? Probably. But would it be as fun and hijinksy as what we got here? Probably not. Matter of fact, I'd probably get some wacky frontier disease.
I'd invest in
I will
that.
also give it. There you go. Nintendo
Okay.
for me. I do give it a 6 out of 7, almost purely for the reason that I can't give everything a 7 out of 7. But one thing I was reminded of is that if they were going to do the animation joke at the end, why not set phasers to fun?
Nice.
And give him the classic animation treatment.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, nice.
I would have liked to see that. And in all seriousness, I think it got a little too spread out amongst the crew, where it left me wanting a little more from everybody. And that always makes me a little bummed in each episode. It's the same thing with Next Generation. There's some episodes where you get to see the whole crew, but it's like, gosh, I wish we got 5 more minutes of Geordi, or 5 more minutes of Data, or 5 more minutes of Riker doing what Riker does best. Let's be honest. I would have liked to see 5 more minutes of Una. I would have liked to get a little bit more into her with the chip on her shoulder. Like, why is nobody talking to me? Why am I? I thought that was a brilliant way of using her character, and I would have liked to see a little more like subterfuge behind the scenes as she's like trying to figure out what the big deal is. I also would have liked it if they would have leaned a little harder into the sort of like the sophomoric humor there, just for obvious reasons, but I digress. 6 out of 7 warp cores. Beautiful episode, truly. This whole season so far has been an achievement. I'm honestly like waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we'll talk about episode 8 here, but episode 9 is the one that gives me the most pause all season. So don't let me forget to mention that at the end. Somebody give me a wink if I don't bring it up again. But with that, I think we came off of a really great dramatic episode into this episode. This was a really nice breath of fresh air with the comedy. I think this whole season and really this series has done a nice job of really balancing you out as a longer series would. I think of Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Next Generation, that had lots and lots of episodes per season, where you did kind of get that mid to late season break episode where it's like, all right, we're going to make it Captain Picard Day and throw him in with a bunch of children. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Those are some of my favorite episodes. And here we get this one, and it's going to probably rank right up there. And then the comeback, which is often the real tipping point towards your season ender, your season cliffhanger. Episode 8, take it away, Wild Thing.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Episode 8, Under the Cloak of War. The director was Jeff W. Bird. The writer is an experienced Star Trek Strange New World scribe, Davy Perez. To recap, in season 1, he wrote Memento Mori, which was our introduction to the Gorn with Lon. He also wrote season 1, episode 9, All Those Who Wander. That was Hemmer's death at the hands of the Gorn. So he had the 2 Gorn episodes in the first season. This season, he's already co-written Amongst the Lotus Eaters, in which Pike and his crew were slowly forgetting themselves, and it was up to Ortegas to reclaim her identity and save the crew. So it can already tell that this is the guy they turn to when they want either the Gorn or PTSD type moments, which he has elucidated very well. And in fact, this episode picks up on the themes that we saw in the very first episode of this season that was written by Akiva Goldsman and Henry Alonzo Myers with Mabenga and Chapel. And it's tough, folks. I mean, this episode couldn't be more of a contrast with the lighthearted Those Old Scientists. We see war as portrayed in a Star Trek context. You know, this goes back, this would have fit right at home with the DS9 Dominion War arc.
Exactly.
And some other ones. I mean, this is on the ground level. And again, I mean, it's not all guts and gore, but there is that sense of hopelessness, of you know, the bombardment of this group under siege, of sending people out to the front lines only to have them come back. Honestly, I was reminded of MASH. And again, not for any comic elements, but the idea that these medical personnel are stitching them up simply to go back out and get killed again. Or, you know, and when the patient that Mabenga has worked on indeed meets, you know, a fairly predictable demise, you still feel something because you see the dilemma of, hey, you know, I'm doing my best to save you, you know, and you still have all this life and essence and energy in you, and yet you're going to go and fight, you know, on this endless carnage. And this show, for the first time, you know, gives us a glimpse of the Klingon War. That was a focal point of Star Trek Discovery Season 1. I mean, so this is now addressing that. And the divisions in the crew, in the sense that some of them fought on the front lines, you know, Mabenga and Chapel obviously being our guide points, Ortegas, and some of them didn't see combat or weren't part of that conflict and thereby have a completely different perspective of what the war can do to you, and what, that kind of trauma inflicted. We had two guest stars in this episode that I want to shout out at the start here. Robert Wisdom played the Ambassador Dak Ra, the infamous Butcher of Jagal. You've seen him most recently in HBO's Barry, TNT's The Alienist, HBO's The Watchmen miniseries, HBO's The Wire, and then he's also popped up in many of your favorite episodes from Law and Order and so forth for, one episode cameos. He's a terrific actor. He speaks with sort of a gravelly low baritone. He kind of reminds me of an older Tony Todd, who memorably played Candyman. And you've seen him around in several genre picks, The Rock with Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage. But Robert Wisdom, he's very good. He can be very scary when he affixes his stare to you. And he's having to play, I think, a role that, again, you kind of think you know where it's going, and then there's, several twists throughout narratively and thematically. And I think that's the jumping off point for my first question. But before I give the first question, I also want to shout out to Clint Howard, Ron's younger brother, and he played the commander on the ground in the medical, and you just know right away, even if you don't know that's Clint Howard, that you're looking at an eccentric character actor who's been acting since he was 2 years old. And he has a unique history with Star Trek. He has appeared on the original series. He has appeared on DS9. He's appeared on Enterprise. He's appeared on Discovery. And now he's appeared on Strange New Worlds. So while he hasn't hit every box checked, he certainly had his share going all the way back to Roddenberry in the 60s. So good for Clint there. But the thing I wanted to say about the Butcher of Jagal, it's sort of a fascinating query, and pushing aside for a second the ultimate resolution of how we learn what his character comes to be. Think about Mabenga and Ortegas and Chapel and stuff, how they react to him through the first 2/3 of the episode. And so I ask you, gentlemen, again, placing yourselves in characters' shoes, are people allowed second chances? Like, are people allowed the benefit of the doubt and forgiveness? Which is what this episode is talking about. Can he be this infamous Klingon warrior, general, butcher, and yet still now want to be a vital, vocal proponent of peace? And I'm just, like I say, I'm just curious, how you guys react to that idea of, it's not a binary choice. It's not like, he is this, therefore he is only this. How do you feel about the ambiguity of possibly being both? That he could be a savage war criminal on the one hand, and yet now want to put all that behind and argue, voraciously for peace. Like, I'm just curious how you guys, what you guys thought of that, how that character was portrayed, and whether or not you would have believed him, because there were certain members of the crew that were willing to listen to that messaging versus others who wanted no part of it.
I think it was beautifully done. And here's why. The journey we take from the original series to Next Generation is one I treasure very much, because the original series is fraught with that Red Scare, Cold War influence, and the Next Generation is far more the utopian future that I think everybody needed in 1987. And this is really tapping into that deep division where there are some people who desperately want to shed the weights of the past and embrace the future. And a lot of those didn't see what brought them to this part of the past. And I think we see that in real life too. I think it's another one of those very well aligned with pop culture or modern culture that harkens right back to the original series, and it's just delicious to see. I ate it up. I have to be honest. The idea of the PTSD and the, you weren't there, you don't know, how could that possibly be somebody who can be redeemed, and then the honest efforts of somebody who's trying to be redeemed, even if they do have a dark, horrific past. The ideas of the next generation future, which I think a lot of people are a little more familiar with these days, would say anybody can be. There's many next generation episodes that deal directly with that, and the idea of rehabilitation. And Seven of Nine is a great example of this. A former Borg reformed, and I think we're kind of used to that innocent optimism of that era of Star Trek, and then to see the flip side of that, where I would say a great many people on the ship or in the time that this allegedly takes place, of course, they feel the opposite. There are a lot of people today who, if you ran into, I'm talking real life, if you ran into a war criminal of some kind, would find them completely irredeemable, regardless of any efforts they've made since then to remediate themselves, or acknowledge the fact they can never undo the past, but they can argue for a better future. It's hard to make that transition, right? You don't get that transition until the original series with Kirk, who sort of discovers this as he goes, is that you can bridge these gaps. There can be some reconciliation, up until the point of the movies where they kill his son, and yet he still finds a way to redeem Klingons in his own eyes. It takes 6 movies, but, it's that sort of painful birth to a better, brighter future that, for better or worse, Spock is the one that brings him along. And is it this moment with Spock and Chapel that informs how he handles Kirk in Star Trek VI?
It's just that's it, yeah.
Not to steal Lord Uther's thunder, but it's like,
fine.
Well, the whole episode played like undiscovered countries dinner table scene. The tensions with Gorkon, which they go through in one scene, and they're like, well, we still have a long ways to go. That's what this whole episode felt like, was that dinner scene basically extrapolated over. Yeah.
And it was wonderful writing. Just outstanding acting. I'll turn it over to Lord Uther, I promise. But I have to give a shout out to the best hackler I've ever seen since Joe Montana, Clint Howard, who by far is one of my favorite character actors, and I was so excited to see him in this episode. I hope he has more appearances in the future because it was fantastic. Okay, Lord Uther, please.
Oh no, you're good. So I so we talk about, are people redeemable? I think when it comes to war and things like that, no. But my caveat to that is time heals all wounds. So the more distance we get, to Urza's point, it takes Kirk 6 movies. I'm sure you both personally know people. I know. Oh, my camera got a little goofy. I know people that have been in combat situations or in war, and their attitudes toward that changed over time, or towards a country changed over time. Because there's a lot of reflection. There's purpose. There's mental things you have to go through to get to that point of healing. So here we are, getting these. You're getting crew members who are coming right off of this war. So of course they're going to be more sensitive than if it's 50 years down the road, right? And so I think you see some of that. I do also like the idea of Spock once again trying to be the one who is going to make all this happen. And I kind of like, we keep talking about this, man. We keep seeing it. Here's young Spock, and not that he's not that he's completely making a mistake, but it's almost like he's reading the room wrong in a sense and trying to force this to happen. And those are the little, and that's, to me, it's a little thing, but it's something that I love, right? He's not the Spock that we get in TOS or the movies. He's still learning. And I think that's very important too. Once again, Captain Pike, Anson Mount, just so good in this episode. Continuously is showing off his acting chops. I like, well, I don't want to jump ahead too far. I can let one of you talk about that. But, I like the twist at the end and how they kind of have done that. We're really questioning what's going to happen moving forward. So, and I know I'm getting off of the original question, but redeeming oneself or redeeming a situation takes time.
And
I'll leave it at that. And I like how we're seeing right off of the end of the war. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
And sort of a quick follow-up on that, I mean, because we covered a lot of ground there with looking at, do I trust him from a war criminal now to a man of peace? You do get that flip side with M'Benga, a character that we've already grown to like, and, how he was trying to save his daughter and just the natural healing type, and how he himself has wanted to move away from a man of violence to a man of healing. But that final scene with him and Chris Pike, it's the kind of writing, it's the kind of, again, moral ambiguity that you'd be right at home with if you were watching Mad Men or Game of Thrones or any other dozen peak TV shows. But it's interesting to kind of appear front and center in a Star Trek show, which, again, for the most part, William Shatner's Kirk is sort of a paragon of heroism, of courage, of decency, of honor. You don't see too many episodes where you're looking at Kirk and saying, God, that guy's got a lot of baggage. But M'Benga, at least, with his war experience and so forth, he is carrying a lot around inside, the trauma, the scars. And so it's fascinating that this show, like in terms of taking risks, will give us a character that unapologetically is confessing to Pike what he's done without ever, just sort of tiptoeing up to the line, but never actually declaring his, guilt. And Pike knows exactly what he's saying. And Pike does not ask him directly, did you kill the ambassador? Because he knows if he asks him that, then Pike's sense of duty and Starfleet honor, it means I have to take him into custody, and it's a thing. So Pike, as the captain knows, he knows the answer, but he chooses to leave the sickbay before he can ask the question because, yeah. And I thought that entire, there's just a tension, and again, terrifically acted between the two on screen. I mean, you're riveted because you're saying to yourself, M'Benga is just saying, yeah, I did it, and I'm not going to say I'm sorry for it without ever actually saying those words. And Pike has that realization because Pike wanted to believe in the new ambassador. He wanted peace, give peace a chance. And, through this encounter and this experience, I mean, those hopes are dashed, if you will. And so it leaves you with sort of this, it's not a sour taste, but it's just this sort of idea of this sort of bitterness that, again, is not a custom Star Trek. Like I say, you'll find that more in a different type of audience show rather than this one, which again still tries to have that Roddenberry positivity where applicable. So I'm curious what you guys think. Like, has your opinion of M'Benga changed? Or is it just like he did what he had to do kind of a thing? Like, I'm curious how you see that character now.
It's a masterclass in writing and acting, truthfully. I think we all enjoyed the ninja kick-ass M'Benga when, they were saving the day and blowing up that stolen Starfleet ship. And then, not really realizing that was exactly what enabled him to be the Butcher of Jagal. And I think the best part about this is it really paints a picture of people who are changed by war, and really paints a picture of early Starfleet. Again, I think it gets back to there's a lot of growing that not just the people on the starship have to do, but Starfleet itself. The warlike culture that sort of belies a far-reaching organization. It's like you have to have some of that, and you don't want to believe it's there, especially if you're watching Next Generation. You're like, oh, I don't want to believe for a second. That's the whole trial with Q, is like proving that they're not warlike like they used to be. And then, of course, you get back to Deep Space Nine, which completely upends that, where they have to get their hands dirty. They have to, for survival, become warlike, ally with the Klingons and and the Cardassians to some extent. They have to do these things, but do they really? I mean, do they really have to commit a potential genocide? Like, is Section 31, like, are they really, like, sanctioned by Starfleet, or is it just sort of an accidental offshoot? And, of course, knowing what we know now about Section 31, and looking forward to that, by the way, very much, as odd as it sounds, it returns and grounds the series again in humanity. And that's what I think the beauty of this show is over maybe a Next Generation or a Voyager, is those are idyllic. Deep Space Nine, the original series, and Strange New Worlds in common have this deep humanity that really, it gives you the best of times and it gives you the worst of times. It's not just playing baseball, it's also dealing with race riots. Like, it's really taking some heavy subjects, putting it in a wonderful sci-fi wrapping, but it's thought-provoking and it's gripping. It's Oscar-worthy material in a TV series form. It's very digestible, but if you take it for more than just the entertainment value and really, critically think about what you're seeing, it becomes something greater. And I think that's Roddenberry's vision. I mean, come true and come alive. And that's where I think it becomes this grandiose masterclass in not only acting, writing, and directing, but in treating the source material well, which I'm a big, big, big fan of.
Well, I think we got my question answered about if Mbenga was going to continue to play up the John Wick role that he had. When the first time I was like, what, are they going to stick with this, or are they going to get away from it? They've obviously stuck it out. They're obviously playing to the point of, in my opinion, the way I see it is, he was this killer for all this time, this stealthy assassin kind of guy who could mess you up, and now he's a doctor to make up for those sins, right? So now he's going to heal. He went from taking life to giving life. And Chapel's right alongside him throughout that whole process. Obviously, with the way the episode ended, it makes us wonder what's going to happen to him. I personally would not mind seeing him now. I can't believe I'm saying this after I was questioning the idea of him being this, again, John Wick type character or special agent. Maybe now he gets called in one last time to do one more job or one more assassination, and then he's out. He's taken out at that point. I don't know. Or maybe he's going to be taken out of the show because he goes on trial. Maybe we're going to see another trial episode at some point. Maybe it sparks. Maybe there's a group of Klingons that come after him. I love that we don't know where it's going to go. That's how well the ending was, that show. You're like, is Pike going to cover it up? Is Pike going to talk around it like he's done with other things and be able to have some masterclass in dialogue and be able to get him out of it? Is Mbenga going to be like, hey, I don't care what happens, right? I did what I had to do. This should have been done before, and I'm the one to take care of it. So I think there's a lot of different aspects that we're seeing here. So even though I wasn't in favor of him when he first showed his assassin type skills, I do like what I saw in this episode. just as a little side thing, I had a little bit of a Starship Troopers feel to
Ooh, there's
this.
another one. Yep.
Just like, I guess for
Oh yeah.
the base that they were in, and just how they were shooting, into the air, kind of reminded me
Yes.
of the bugs that were shooting up into the air. Anyway, I had a little bit of a feel to that.
Yes, very relevant.
So yeah, it's going to be again. I brought this up a little earlier. Where are the Gorn? It keeps making me ask that question. But this episode, even though that question isn't getting answered, this episode did not disappoint.
The Gorn will show up in the musical episode, and it's going to blow your mind. So, no, I think we should also. I mean, she gets to be in the episode, particularly on the planet. But with Christine, it's interesting how she's feeling the same pain M'Benga is and Erica is, and Spock wants to comfort her, and she can't be healed by the presence of someone else. She has to do some of the work herself. And I just liked it, just looking at it as purely a relationship moment there. I mean, that rang very true in the sense it's like, look, I know you care about me and I care about you, but you can't fix this. And I just need to be in my own space right now to be able to do that healing. And so again, it's a quick scene midway through the show, but I thought it captures the truth, of whether that's an established relationship over time or something just still, trying to find its way forward. I thought that was a great little moment between them. And what we were talking about, show us their relationship, but I don't need an hour rom-com with them. Just give me little snippets to show how it's going. And I thought that was a very well realized moment there. So.
Agreed. I really enjoyed that as well. It felt very real. I have to say the last two episodes really anchored the show in humanity, which I think is a lot of people who are anti-sci-fi, I guess. I don't think anybody's really anti-sci-fi, but are not as inclined to enjoy sci-fi. Their big thing is that it seems so unreal. It seems so, spacey and out there. But again, I think this is a show where you could watch a standalone episode and appreciate it for its nuance and its subtlety and its humanity. Totally. Just splendid, really, honestly. And I think that's a great point for us to evaluate this episode on a scale of 7 warp cores. Especially having considered the last episode. I think this is an interesting one with a lot of merits to discuss. But let's start with Wild Thing. What did you think?
I'm going to go 7 on this one because of the ambiguities and the moral questions that go beyond the limitations of a single episode. If you can get a show that you can engage you at a surface level as entertainment, but then you spend the next few days thinking about it and possibly, rethinking your approach and your attitudes and so forth. If it can get you to even, question your own orientation, in terms of these issues, then I think that's when you're making, strong, compelling television such as it is. And like I say, I was racked with the idea of second chances and who deserves them and who doesn't. Does the drunk driver who, killed one of your family members because they'd been drinking and they go to jail for it and they come out and they want to make amends, do you have it in your heart to forgive them? I mean, taking an extreme analogy to that. Like I say, who gets second chances? How much can we open our hearts to that? How much can we believe in that? Those are all things that, speak to the universality of being a human. And I think this show, in this context, captures some of that really well. So, yeah, I'm going to go 7.
To your last point, or your last comment there, sometimes the healing doesn't begin until that person forgives themselves for what happened, right? Even though they're involved in something, and are told to do something. A comment my father had made was he really struggled when he was in Vietnam because the government told him that's your enemy. And he goes, if it was anything else, any other time in life, maybe that would be my friend. Like, I don't know. So it took a lot of self-healing for him. Like, he had to forgive himself for what happened. And that always is kind of stuck in my head. So I'm gonna go 7 out of 7 on this one. It's there. It sets up a lot of things, and that's something we've seen a lot, by the way, from I think a lot of these episodes. Is there are things that it can go either way, and we're not sure. We're obviously not going to get a resolution to it in the next episode because they're going to be rocking and rolling. I'm personally looking forward to it. I've got my own theory as to what causes that. I kind of shared it with y'all offline. Again, great acting. The actor who plays Mbenga, fantastic. Chapel. I even liked Una, being like, this guy, we got to get this guy off the ship. Like, it's getting dangerous. I like that little piece of it too. Pike trying to be the peacekeeper in a sense, asking his crew to face what happened, right? I mean, that's really what he was doing. He was like, hey, you know what? I need you. And maybe, and I felt like he was hinting at maybe it's going to help you in the long run. And we see the true loyalty to this captain, right? This isn't a Picard season 3 where the crew isn't completely lined up with the captain at the time, right? This is a crew that goes, I mean, Mbenga even says it, right? Pike, Chris needs us. He's calling him Chris, by the way, which I love that, to show the relationship. Chris needs us. Like, we're going because he needs us. And that's the loyalty you would expect on a ship. Which, to go back to Picard Season 3, it's just another reason why. Help me with the captain of the ship, of the Titan. Shaw. That's why I love that character so much, and that's the discussion we had before. Are more of the Captain Shaws or more of the Captain's Picards? That's the question that may never be answered, but I think that's an important question. In this episode, we're seeing, Pike is that guy. They're going to do this for Pike. And it speaks a lot. I think it just adds a little more to his already incredibly established character.
Very well put. I'm also a 7 out of 7 warp cores. As I just said, I'm not going to do 7s anymore. It's a very high bar. No, seriously, I think I'm right with you guys. I especially liked how Wild Thing put it here with any episode of television that engages you on a deeper level than just being entertained or just being even having your thoughts provoked mildly. Is pretty common these days. But going beyond that and to really question some of these foundational, very human aspects, that's a Roddenberry thing. I mean, you very rarely encounter that in any form of media, let alone a television show based in space. Star Trek has always been thought-provoking, but I think you can easily stray a little too far and get a little too metaphysical, or you can be a little too surface level and a little too cheesy, and that's where a lot of sci-fi tends to fall, but somehow Star Trek continuously gets it right, and this just took it to a whole other level because you were hitting on some very deep subjects, and there wasn't really an obvious Shakespearean comic relief. There weren't breaks in the tension that you would expect. And this is a very tense episode from start to credits. I mean, there was really no, moment where you're like, oh, thank God, I needed a break here. That's why I think the next episode is what it is because I think the cast is going to be in that same vein. They're going to need that break after having dealt with this and then whatever the fallout is, which is I'm sure going to be in the first couple minutes of just recapping. Boy, remember last week when that Klingon died? Oh, jeepers. I doubt it's going to be that cheesy, but then again, it's a musical episode. And I don't know. I mean, again, this show delivers a perfect episode of television. I can't wrap my head around how they keep getting it right. And it makes me scared because I'm waiting for that other shoe to drop where it's like, even if it's just a good episode, like a solid episode, I almost feel like it's going to be a little disappointing because, like, yeah, that was good, but man, it really felt like filler, or it just didn't hit as heavily as the rest of this. Which, to be honest, and I think we'll have to be honest with ourselves if this future episode goes the way that I am so scared that it will. We may have to admit for a moment that we kind of needed a bit of a stinker to sort of right the ship back and reset the bar to an attainable level. Because, to be honest, how do you maintain such high dramatic tension throughout a whole series? You just can't. Look at Law and Order. They have to, like, drive your adrenaline levels up, like, within 3 minutes of the show, or you don't give a shit and you change the channel. And then they have to keep you there through commercials. So that's my fear, but they've always proven me wrong whenever I feared for it. I was very scared for the Lower Decks episode, and that was great. So, again, here on the Warp Core podcast, we stand with SAG-AFTRA and the WGA, because Strange New Worlds is the product you get when you have a fair deal, a rational deal, and you deal well with the people who should be dealt well with, because my goodness, are they delivering some significant product. Fellas, we are on the other side of our first 50 episodes, on the other side of the second half, I should say, of the first 50 episodes. We have boldly gone where no Warp Core podcast has gone before. We are almost to the conclusion of the second season of Strange New Worlds Paramount Plus. If you're just watching us and have never watched the series before, highly recommend it, obviously. Likewise, recommend you go back on our YouTube page, hit that subscribe button, drop us a like, drop us a comment. Certainly, take a look at all of our great material we have out there on pending rebrand. We are the Warp Core Podcast. I'm UrzaMaster. That's Lord Uther. Joining us as always, our recurring host, no longer a guest, Ricky Wild Thing Vaughn. As always, live long and prosper.